My name is Eleanor Winters, and I was 68 years old the day my son-in-law decided to remind everyone in the room exactly how small he thought I was. I remember the moment clearly, not because it was loud, but because it was quiet in the way humiliation often is. I had just stepped into the living room, still wearing my cream-colored suit, my hands wrapped carefully around a cardboard box with a ribbon tied too tight. Inside was an apple cake I had baked before sunrise, standing at my kitchen counter while my joints protested every movement. I had come straight from a long morning, tired but determined to arrive with something warm, something made by my own hands. The room was full. Conversations overlapped. Laughter rose and fell. I took 2 steps forward when David looked up from his glass and smiled. "Well," he said, his voice carrying easily across the room. "You came straight from work, didn't you?" He paused just long enough to make sure people were listening. "You smell like a cleaner." A few people laughed. Others shifted uncomfortably. No one corrected him. My face burned. I felt the familiar urge to apologize for taking up space, for existing where I apparently didn't belong. I turned toward the door, already planning my exit, already deciding which excuse would sound least dramatic. That was when my daughter grabbed my hand. Her fingers were tight around mine. Not gentle, not reassuring, desperate. She leaned close, her voice low and uneven, and spoke directly into my ear. "Mom," she whispered, "please don't leave. Just stay today. Tomorrow, everything changes." I looked at her face and saw something I hadn't expected. Fear, yes, but also resolve. The kind that comes from having already crossed a line you can't uncross. I stayed. I sat down, placed the cake on the table, and folded my hands in my lap. David went back to talking as if nothing had happened. The room resumed its noise, but something had shifted inside me. I didn't understand what was coming yet. I only knew this moment was not accidental. And whatever my daughter was asking me to endure, it was part of something much larger than my pride. I stayed near the doorway longer than I should have, holding that box of cake, as if it might slip out of my hands if I loosened my grip. No one offered to take it. No one asked how my day had been. David had already turned back to his guests, his comment floating away like it had never mattered, like it hadn't just landed squarely on my chest. I told myself to move. Standing there only made it worse. When I finally walked into the kitchen, I set the box down carefully on the counter. My fingers throbbed as I pulled my hands back. The skin around my knuckles felt tight and dry, the way it always did after a long shift. I focused on the small, ordinary sounds around me, the refrigerator humming, the faint clink of dishes, someone laughing too loudly in the other room. Ordinary things had always helped me steady myself. I had spent most of my adult life cleaning other people's homes. It wasn't something I ever planned to do forever, but plans change when life does. After Robert died, work became less about pride and more about survival. I learned how to scrub tile until it shone and how to make myself small in houses that weren't mine. Over time, I learned something else, too. People often decide who you are based on how you earn your living. Some look past it, others don't. David never did. At the dining table, conversations rolled on without me. Vacations to places I'd only seen on television. Renovations that cost more than I'd earned in a year. I nodded when it felt appropriate. Answered politely when someone asked me a question. I kept my posture straight, even when my back began to ache. When David tasted the cake, he frowned theatrically. "Honestly," he said, setting his fork down, "I don't know how clean your kitchen really is." There was a brief, uncomfortable silence. I felt the word clean settle inside me, heavy and sharp. I had heard it all my life, usually spoken the same way, half joke, half judgment. I glanced at Rachel. Her shoulders had stiffened, her eyes fixed on her plate. Sophie was watching me instead, her expression tight, almost angry. I met her gaze and shook my head slightly. Not now. I didn't want this to turn into something loud or ugly. Not here. I had learned through years of swallowing my reactions that silence could be useful. It gave you time to notice things. And as I sat there, pretending to be unbothered, I began to notice more than I ever had before. David interrupted me whenever I tried to speak, but no one else. He corrected small details that didn't matter. He smiled while doing it as if he were being helpful. Each comment landed softly, but together they formed a pattern I couldn't ignore. This wasn't careless. It was practiced. I thought back over the past few months, the questions he'd asked about my house, always framed as concern. Whether I'd updated my will, whether managing bills was becoming stressful for me. He had suggested casually that Rachel could help keep things organized, as if it were a kindness. At the time, I'd brushed it off. Now, sitting there with my half-eaten cake in front of me, those conversations took on a different shape. When I finally stood to leave, my legs felt unsteady, but my voice stayed calm. Rachel followed me to the door. Up close, I could see the strain in her face, the way she was holding herself together by force of will. "Thank you for staying," she said quietly. "For what?" I asked. She hesitated, then met my eyes.
"For trusting me."
I wanted to ask her what she meant. I wanted to demand answers, but something in her expression stopped me. Fear, yes, but also resolve. Whatever was happening, she was already in the middle of it. As I stepped outside, the cool air hit my face, and I realized my hands were shaking. I sat in my car for a moment before starting the engine, breathing slowly until the tightness in my chest eased. I drove home, replaying every word, every glance, every laugh that hadn't quite sounded right. By the time I pulled into my driveway, one thought had settled firmly in my mind. If David believed I was too old, too tired, or too invisible to notice what he was doing, he was wrong. And whatever Rachel was trying to protect me from, I was no longer willing to look away. I didn't sleep much that night. My body was exhausted, but my thoughts kept circling the same moments over and over, like they were asking to be examined more closely. Every comment David had made, every look he'd given me, the way the room had laughed, then quickly moved on, as if nothing important had happened. By morning, I felt strangely clear-headed. I went through my usual routine. Coffee, toast, the local news murmuring in the background. But instead of rushing out the door, I sat at my small kitchen table and opened the drawer where I kept my paperwork, deeds, bank statements, old insurance forms, things I had always handled myself, quietly without help. I realized how easily someone could decide those things were too complicated for me. Now, that afternoon, Rachel came by after work. She didn't take off her coat. She didn't sit down. She stood in the middle of my living room, twisting her hands together the way she used to when she was a child and didn't know how to start a difficult conversation. "He's been asking again," she said finally. "About what?" I asked, though I already knew. "Your house, your accounts, whether you've thought about giving me power of attorney." Her voice wavered on the last words. "He says it's just planning ahead." I watched her carefully. "And what do you think?" Rachel swallowed. "I think he's been planning something for a while." The silence between us stretched. I felt a familiar instinct rise in me. The urge to protect her, to tell her not to worry. But I stopped myself. That instinct had served me well as a mother, but it wasn't what this moment required. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I asked. Her shoulders sagged. "Because he said no one would believe you. He said if you pushed back, he'd tell people you were confused, that you needed help." The words landed harder than David's jokes ever had. I had seen women dismissed that way before, brushed aside with a concerned smile and a lowered voice. I just never thought it would happen so close to home. After Rachel left, I noticed things I hadn't allowed myself to see before. Missed calls from David that he never mentioned later. Emails copied to Rachel, but addressed to me, written in language that felt just a little too complicated. He always spoke for me in group settings, answering questions before I could open my mouth. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. That was the most unsettling part. It was quiet, careful, and patient. A few days later, Sophie came over to help me carry groceries inside. She moved through the house with the easy confidence of someone who had grown up there. But when she set the bags down, she didn't leave right away. She hovered, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "Grandma," she said, "can I ask you something?" I nodded. "Do you feel like he talks about you like you're not in the room?" The question startled me, not because it was wrong, but because it was so precise. I studied her face, the seriousness there, and realized she had been paying attention in a way most adults hadn't.
"He thinks I don't notice," I said.
Sophie's jaw tightened. He's wrong. From then on, things moved quietly but deliberately. Rachel began saving messages. Sophie paid closer attention to what was said when David thought no one was listening. I kept notes in a small notebook by my bed, writing down dates and conversations. Not because I planned to use them, but because writing made me feel anchored. I understood now why Rachel had asked me to stay that afternoon. David needed me to look small. He needed others to see me that way, too. It would make everything else easier for him later. When the invitation came for another family gathering the following weekend, I felt a familiar tightening in my chest. Part of me wanted to refuse to stay home safe and quiet. Instead, I heard my own voice say yes. As I hung up the phone, I realized something had changed. I was no longer just enduring what was happening. I was watching it unfold step by step, fully aware. And for the first time, I sensed that David's careful performance was nearing its final act. The house was already full when we arrived. Cars lined the street, and the noise spilled out through the open front door before we even stepped inside. I moved more slowly than usual, not because my body ached, but because I wanted to notice everything. The smell of food, the scrape of shoes on the floor, the way voices rose and fell. This time, I wasn't here to endure. I was here to observe, to remember, to stay present in a way I never had before. David stood near the fireplace, drink in hand, perfectly at ease. He laughed easily, greeting people with the confidence of someone who believed the room belonged to him. When he saw me, his smile tightened for just a moment before settling back into place, as if he were adjusting a mask. "Eleanor made it," he said, loud enough for several people to turn. "I'm really glad you could come." It sounded generous, warm, even. If I hadn't spent months listening more carefully than he realized, I might have believed it. Rachel stayed close to my side, her presence steady and deliberate. She didn't speak much, but every now and then her arm brushed mine, grounding me. Sophie lingered nearby, quieter than usual, her phone tucked safely into her pocket.
She didn't look at David. She didn't need to.
Dinner passed with polite conversation and careful manners. I noticed how often David answered questions that weren't directed at him, how he spoke about my life as if it were a report he had memorized and rehearsed. He explained my routines, my limitations, my supposed needs. I let him talk. Each sentence revealed more than he understood. As dessert was served, I felt a familiar tightening in my chest, the old instinct to excuse myself, to leave before something else could be said. Instead, I stayed seated, my hands folded in my lap, my breathing slow and even. When the plates were cleared and people settled back into their chairs, David stood and tapped his glass lightly with a spoon. The sound rang sharper than he probably intended. The room hushed almost immediately. He spoke about responsibility and family, about how difficult it can be to watch loved ones grow older. His voice softened when he mentioned me, taking on a tone that suggested compassion rather than control. "When someone starts to struggle," he said, glancing in my direction, "it's our duty to step in, even if they don't fully understand what's best for them." The words were smooth, practiced, designed to sound reasonable. I could feel the room leaning toward him, nodding along, ready to accept his version of concern. That was when Rachel stood up. Her chair scraped softly against the floor, a small sound that seemed to cut through the quiet like a blade. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. She simply asked everyone to listen, her hands resting at her sides to keep them from shaking. Sophie stepped forward beside her and unlocked her phone. The recording began to play. David's voice filled the room, stripped of warmth and polish. He talked about timing, about waiting until I was tired or overwhelmed, about documents I wouldn't fully read, about controlling my assets, about moving me somewhere cheaper once everything was signed and settled. No one interrupted. No one laughed. Faces shifted as understanding settled in. Confusion giving way to disbelief, then to something heavier and harder to ignore. A man stepped forward and introduced himself as Mr. Harrison, the lawyer Rachel had consulted weeks earlier. He spoke calmly, explaining what the recording demonstrated and what laws existed to protect people in my position. He explained terms slowly, clearly, without condescension. He didn't threaten. He didn't dramatize. He simply explained consequences. David tried to speak. His mouth opened, then closed. His smile faltered, then disappeared entirely. For the first time since I had known him, words failed him. I stood quietly, my hands folded in front of me. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel angry. I felt grounded, as if my feet were finally planted on solid ground. For months, I had allowed myself to shrink, to take up less space so others could feel comfortable speaking over me. Standing there, I realized how unnecessary that had been. I hadn't changed. Only the story being told about me had. I met David's eyes once. There was no satisfaction in it. Only clarity. He looked away first. The room remained silent for a long moment. No one rushed to fill it. No one needed to. The truth had settled where it belonged. Some people avoided my gaze, ashamed. Others looked at me with something new, something quieter, respect perhaps, or recognition that I had been listening all along, even when they thought I wasn't. When we finally left, Rachel let out a breath she had been holding far too long. Sophie slipped her hand into mine, her grip steady and reassuring, stronger than I expected. Outside, the evening air was cool against my face. I felt lighter, not because everything was resolved, but because the truth no longer belonged only to me. It was finally shared, witnessed, and impossible to erase behind us. The door closed quietly, sealing a chapter one would never step back into again, and with it, the version of me David had tried to create finally disappeared for good. The days after that night moved slowly, almost politely, as if the world had decided to step back and give me room to breathe. I woke each morning without urgency, noticing light through the curtains, noticing silence, noticing how my body felt without the pressure of constant vigilance. There were phone calls, measured conversations, and pauses where nothing was said, yet everything was understood. I answered what needed answering and allowed the rest to pass without comment. Rachel began visiting more often, not with apologies or explanations, but with presence. She brought groceries, helped sort mail, and sat with me in the evenings while the television murmured in the background. Some nights we talked about the past carefully and honestly. Other nights we spoke about ordinary things, and that felt just as important. The space between us softened, no longer filled with fear or secrecy. The legal matters unfolded slowly, the way real life insists on doing. I met with a lawyer I trusted, reviewed documents line by line, and asked questions until I felt steady. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was hidden behind complicated language. Updating my will felt uncomfortable at first, but it also felt grounding, like putting something fragile back into its proper place. When it was done, I slept deeply for the first time in months. Rachel filed for divorce quietly. There were no dramatic scenes, no raised voices, only paperwork and resolve. When she told me, her voice was calm and clear. I did not ask her to explain herself. She had already done the hardest part. Supporting her meant respecting her silence as much as her words. Sophie began coming over most afternoons after school. She spread her books across my kitchen table, tapping her pencil while she worked, filling the room with small sounds of concentration. Sometimes she asked for help.
Sometimes she talked about her day.
I watched her carefully and saw a steadiness forming, a confidence shaped by having witnessed the truth spoken aloud. I stopped cleaning houses full-time. My body had been asking for rest longer than I cared to admit. Letting go of that work felt strange, like setting down a weight I had carried for decades. Some mornings I missed the routine. Other days I sat on my porch with a cup of tea, watching shadows move across the yard, feeling something close to peace. Neighbors waved as they passed. A few stopped to talk, their questions gentle and indirect. I did not offer explanations. I had learned that clarity does not require confession. What mattered had already been addressed where it truly counted. I spent time thinking about dignity, about how easily it can be taken once someone is labeled old or inconvenient. Concern can shift into control when no one challenges it. I had seen that happen to others, and now I understood it from the inside. Cruelty does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes wrapped in politeness, disguised as help, spoken in calm, reasonable tones. What stayed with me most was realizing that I had been paying attention all along. Even when I doubted myself, even when I chose silence, some part of me was awake and recording. Silence, I learned, is not ignorance. Sometimes it is preparation for truth. Healing did not arrive as a single moment. It arrived quietly through ordinary mornings, through decisions made without fear, through listening to discomfort instead of dismissing it. I practiced trusting myself again, one small choice at a time. I learned that boundaries are not punishments, but protections, lines drawn to keep what is tender safe. I still bake, not to impress anyone and not to prove anything. I bake because the rhythm feels familiar, because my hands still remember what to do. Sophie often sits nearby and talks while I work. Rachel sometimes joins us, leaning against the counter, listening more than she speaks. Life did not become perfect. It became honest. I no longer stay in rooms where I am diminished or conversations where I am spoken over. Age has not made me invisible. It has shown me who is willing to look, and that is enough. That is what remains. I think now about how many moments I spent doubting myself simply because someone spoke with confidence. I had mistaken certainty for truth, volume for authority, and familiarity for safety. Those assumptions kept me quiet longer than necessary. Letting them go felt like learning a new language, one spoken slowly with attention. I noticed how often women my age are encouraged to be grateful instead of careful, agreeable instead of alert. The expectation is subtle but persistent.
Smile.
Don't make trouble. Accept help even when it feels wrong. Walking away from that script was uncomfortable, but it was also freeing. I began choosing my days with intention, deciding where to spend my energy and where not to. I no longer explained my choices unless explanation was truly required. Peace, I discovered, is not the absence of conflict, but the absence of self-betrayal. It grows when actions align with instinct, when silence is chosen rather than imposed. I may move more slowly now, but I see more clearly. That clarity has become my companion, steady and reliable. It reminds me that dignity is not something given by others. It is something carried, protected, and when necessary, defended with quiet resolve. These lessons remain with me daily, shaping decisions, strengthening boundaries, and allowing a calm confidence to replace long-held fear inside me.